The neighborhood had always carried an air of quiet menace, the kind that wasn't immediately obvious but lingered like smoke after a fire, and my wife Elena had often said she felt watched whenever she walked past the HOA office at the edge of the cul-de-sac. I used to laugh it off, thinking her worries came from too many late-night crime documentaries, but all of that changed on the day a group of so-called HOA officers showed up at our front porch in uniforms that weren't quite police, but weren't civilian either, with shiny badges clipped to cheap tactical vests and radios strapped to their belts, barking orders like they had authority. They claimed there had been multiple violations on our property, grass too high, a motorcycle parked in the driveway, a flag not properly displayed, nonsense complaints that could have been addressed with a letter. Yet here they were, pounding on our door like a SWAT raid. Elena, never one to back down, opened the door and told them flat out they had no right to be here, that if they had an issue they could call the county, but the tallest one, a shaved-head guy with sunglasses, even in the shade, stepped forward and shoved her against the porch rail so hard she lost balance, tried to fight him off, and when she did, another one grabbed her arm and twisted until a loud, sickening crack split the air, leaving her screaming in pain while they told her she was resisting HOA enforcement. I ran from the garage, shouting at them to back off, but they pointed at me with their radios and muttered something about calling backup, so I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled out my phone and filmed everything, their fake uniforms, their ridiculous power trip posturing, my wife curled up clutching her arm, and it was only when I told them the video was live streaming that they backed away, spitting curses and warning me that this isn't over. I rushed Elena inside, trembling with rage as she sobbed against me, and after calling an ambulance and getting her to the ER, the x-rays confirmed it. Her forearm was broken in two places, a cast required, weeks of recovery ahead of her, all because a group of wannabe enforcers thought intimidation equaled authority. I wanted justice, called the police, filed reports, even showed them the footage, but bureaucracy worked slow, and the HOA board denied knowing anything about these officers, pretending they were just security volunteers gone rogue, while in reality, they were covering up, hoping we'd swallow their lies and go away. That night, as I sat by Elena's bedside with her arm in a sling and anger boiling through every vein, I made a decision. If the system wouldn't deliver payback, then family would, and I had just the family for it. My cousins from the biker club, men and women who lived on the edge, who rode with leather and steel, who believed in loyalty above all else. They weren't strangers to rough justice, and when I called them and told them what happened, there was silence on the line for a beat before my cousin Vince, the club's sergeant-at-arms, said in a low, dangerous voice, "Nobody breaks family bones and walks away breathing easy." Within hours, engines were roaring down from the highway, chrome shining under the moon, a dozen Harleys pulling into my driveway like thunder announcing a storm, and as Elena slept upstairs, Vince put a hand on my shoulder and said they'd handle it. No hesitation, no questions, just vengeance written across their scarred faces. I should have felt nervous, but instead a grim satisfaction settled in my chest because these fake HOA cops had no idea what storm they had unleashed, and tomorrow the neighborhood would learn the price of messing with blood and bone. The next morning, the rumble of bikes still echoed in my driveway, neighbors peeking through blinds as if the sight of patched leather jackets and chrome exhausts was more terrifying than the fake HOA goons who had broken my wife's arm. And while the cul-de-sac buzzed with whispers, my cousins sat around my kitchen table drinking black coffee from chipped mugs, maps and notepads spread out like it was wartime planning. Vince, heavy set with tattoos creeping up his neck, tapped the table with A. Knife as he spoke, first rule of revenge. Know your enemy, and he had already sent two of the younger riders, Mick and Travis, around the neighborhood to sniff out information, because in communities like this, gossip traveled faster than mail. Sure enough, within an hour they came back with gold. The names of the men in the fake uniforms, HOA members who had self-appointed themselves as officers to scare residents into submission, running around in surplus gear and acting like cops, and the ringleader was none other than Daniel Pierce, the smug president of the HOA board who had been on a power trip for years, using fines and threats to control everyone. Vince leaned back in his chair, grinning without humor, and said, "Sounds like Pierce needs a wake-up call," but before launching straight into violence, the bikers wanted to send a message, one that would strip away the illusion of authority those clowns thought they carried. That afternoon we rode out. Yes, even I put on A. helmet, and climbed on the back of Vince's bike, rolling down the subdivision streets in a growling column. Neighbors pouring out to watch as the outlaw cavalry rolled past their manicured lawns, stopping directly in front of the HOA office where Pierce and his cronies like to hold their meetings. Vince killed the engine, dismounted, and slammed the office door open so hard it rattled on its hinges, and the so-called officers inside jumped like kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar, their cheap uniforms hanging off them like Halloween costumes. Vince tossed one of their fake badges on the table and growled, "You break a woman's arm and call enforcement? That ain't law. That's cowardice. And cowards answer to us now." The room went silent, Pierce's smug expression flickering with fear, before he tried to regain control, waving his hands and calling us outsiders who had no say in community matters. But Vince leaned close enough that Pierce had to flinch back from the smell of leather and smoke, whispering, "You made it my matter when you hurt blood," before pulling back and motioning to the others. What followed wasn't violence, not yet, but psychological warfare, the bikers flooding the HOA office with presents, tearing down the posters about rules, dumping a stack of their phony citations into the trash, and carving their club insignia into the wooden meeting table with a hunting knife, leaving a permanent scar that made Pierce grind his teeth in helpless rage. Neighbors filmed the whole thing on their phones, cheering quietly from sidewalks because, truth be told, everyone had grown sick of Pierce's rule, but no one dared challenge him until now, and the sight of a dozen leather-clad bikers standing up for justice lit a fire in the neighborhood. When we finally rode off, leaving the office in shambles, Vince turned to me and said, "That was the first warning. Next time it gets messy," and I knew he meant it. That night, as Elena dozed upstairs, I sat with Vince on the porch, the smell of motor oil and cigarette smoke heavy in the air, and I admitted my fear, not of the bikers, but of how far this might go, whether revenge would spiral into something we couldn't control. But Vince only chuckled, saying, "Control is an illusion. Respect is real. And after what they did, respect won't come from words." The following day, retaliation from Pierce was inevitable. Flyers appeared on every doorstep warning about criminal biker gang threatening the safety of the community, a clear attempt to turn the neighbors against us, but instead of fear, it sparked anger at the hypocrisy. Because everyone had seen the video of Elena's broken arm, and everyone knew these so-called officers were nothing but bullies. The tide was shifting, and Pierce felt it, yet instead of backing down, he doubled down, calling his goons together for late-night patrols, strutting around with flashlights and radios trying to look tough, but the bikers shadowed them silently, revving engines just out of sight, making the cowards jump at every sound until their nerves frayed. Vince's plan was simple: break their spirit before breaking their bones, and by the third night, Pierce's men were twitching wrecks, stumbling through the neighborhood, pretending to guard lawns while shaking at every echo of Harley pipes. Rolling through the dark, I realized then that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about turning the balance of fear upside down, making the people who inflicted terror taste it themselves. And though part of me worried how far Vince and the crew would go, another part of me, the angriest part, wanted them to go further to make sure Pierce and his fake cops never dared lay a hand on another neighbor again. By the end of that week, the quiet war lines were drawn, and while the bikers had the edge in intimidation, Pierce wasn't about to surrender his little empire without a fight. He called an emergency HOA meeting, stacking the room with his loyalists and announcing that the neighborhood would be hiring professional security, which was just a fancy way of saying his fake officers would now get paid from community dues, a move that sparked shouting matches as homeowners accused him of theft and corruption. But Pierce, red-faced and desperate, hammered the gavel and declared, "This community needs law and order, and I will provide it." The irony wasn't lost on anyone, considering his law had already put my wife in a cast, but his desperation made him reckless. And within days, new barricades appeared at the entrances of the neighborhood, manned by his thugs with clipboards and flashlights, stopping cars and demanding to see IDs as though the subdivision were a military base. That was the last straw for Vince and the crew, because what Pierce had done wasn't just harassment anymore. It was escalation, a direct attempt to build his own kingdom inside the county, and the bikers were never going to let that stand. Vince gathered us in my garage late one night, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead as he laid out the counterattack. We hit them where it hurt, strip away the illusion, and leave him standing naked in front of everyone he thinks he controls, he said, and the plan he unveiled was as bold as it was dangerous, rolling through the barricades in broad daylight, dismantling them piece by piece, and confronting Pierce in front of every neighbor with cameras rolling, exposing his lies once and for all. I felt a knot in my stomach at the thought, but looking at Elena resting with her cast, her eyes burning with quiet fury, I knew I couldn't back down, not when she whispered, "Make them pay," with more conviction than I'd ever heard from her before. So we rode, engines roaring like war drums, tearing down the main street in formation, a column of steel and leather that made the barricade. Guards scatter before they even realized what was happening, the sheer weight of our presence making their bravado melt into fear. One tried to wave a clipboard and yell stop, but Travis leaned from his bike and snatched it away, tossing it into the gutter while the rest of us ripped the wooden barricades from the asphalt and stacked them in a pile, setting them ablaze with lighter fluid until flames licked the sky and neighbors poured out to cheer. By the time we reached the HOA office, the community had fallen in behind us like an impromptu parade, phone cameras high, voices chanting for Pierce to come out, and when he finally emerged, his cheap suit rumpled, fake officers flanking him with trembling hands, then stepped forward and bellowed, "You don't run this place anymore." Pierce tried to speak, waving his arms and shouting about trespassing and criminal threats, but nobody listened. His voice was drowned out by boos and jeers from the very people he thought he ruled, and when Vince motioned, the bikers dragged out crates of files stolen from the office earlier that morning, stacks of fraudulent fines, receipts showing Pierce had funneled thousands into his personal account, and they dumped them on the pavement for all to see, papers flying through the air like confetti while neighbors gasped at the proof of his corruption. Pierce's face went pale, and in that moment his fake officers wavered, realizing the tide had turned, some even backing away from him to avoid sharing his fate. But the ringleader wasn't finished yet. Desperate, he pulled a handgun from his waistband, illegal, unregistered, and shaking in his sweaty grip, and pointed it at Vince, screaming that we were all under arrest. The crowd froze, the cheers silenced by the sudden flash of steel. But Vince didn't flinch, just smirked with that wolfish calm he carried in every fight and said, "You don't scare me, pencil pusher," before nodding toward the side where my cousin Lena, tough as nails and quick as a rattlesnake, lunged and slapped the weapon from Pierce's hand, kicking it across the asphalt to the roar of the crowd. Chaos exploded, neighbors surging forward, some grabbing the fleeing fake officers while others hurled insults at Pierce, and in the middle of it, Vince raised his arms and shouted, "This is your community. Take it back." The words struck like lightning, electrifying everyone into action, and for the first time, Pierce looked small, surrounded, exposed, a man who had built a throne out of fear, only to watch it crumble beneath him. The police eventually arrived, sirens wailing, called not by Pierce but by nervous neighbors, and when they saw the mountain of evidence against him, plus the video of him brandishing an illegal weapon, they slapped handcuffs on him right there in front of everyone, his face contorted in rage as he screamed about conspiracies and biker gangs, but nobody bought it anymore. As they shoved him into the squad car, Vince turned to me with a grin and said, "That's checkmate, cousin." And though my heart was still racing, I realized he was right. Pierce's reign was over, but in the pit of my stomach, I also knew that this wasn't the end, because men like him don't go down without leaving scars, and his allies, humiliated and bitter, weren't going to forgive what we'd just done without planning some kind of revenge of their own. For a brief moment after Pierce was hauled off in handcuffs, it felt like peace had finally returned, neighbors clapping each other on the back, Elena smiling faintly from the porch as she watched the bikers bask in the glow of victory, and I allowed myself to think maybe the storm had passed. But storms never end so neatly, and 2 nights later, we learned just how deep Pierce's poison ran, because though he sat in jail awaiting charges, his most loyal cronies weren't about to let their self-styled empire collapse without a final stand. Around midnight, the sound of shattering glass woke me, and by the time I stumbled to the window, I saw flames licking at my garage door, Molotov cocktails hurled by masked men who bolted into the dark, their getaway car peeling rubber down the cul-de-sac, leaving fire and chaos behind. I screamed for Elena to get out, but before I could even grab the extinguisher, Vince and the others were already on it. Hoses spraying, boots kicking through smoke, their discipline under fire proving just how many battles they'd seen. And within minutes, the blaze was contained, my garage blackened, but my home intact. Yet the message was clear. Pierce's allies had declared open war. Vince's face was stone as he gathered the crew in the smoldering driveway, saying in a voice that cut through the smoke, they crossed the line. No more warnings. We end this tonight. There was no debate, no hesitation, just a flurry of leather jackets, zipping and engines roaring to life, the neighborhood once again shaken awake by the thunder of Harleys, and this time I rode at the front, my pulse hammering with a mix of fear and rage, because they hadn't just hurt Elena anymore, they'd tried to burn us alive. Following tips from neighbors who'd seen where the masked men fled, we tracked them to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, a rat's nest where the worst of Pierce's fake officers had gathered, maybe half a dozen men with bats, crowbars, and the same cheap uniforms, pacing like cornered animals waiting for a fight. The bikers didn't wait long. Vince led the charge, booting open the warehouse doors, our engines echoing like thunder inside as we rode straight through the dusty floor, scattering them in panic, and what followed was chaos in its rawest form, fists and chains clashing against steel and bone, the smell of oil and sweat mixing with blood. As battle erupted, I'll never forget the sight of Lena swinging her chain like a whip, cracking it across a thug's shoulder and dropping to the ground, or Travis vaulting from his bike mid-ride to tackle a man swinging a crowbar, the two of them rolling in the dirt until Travis planted a punch that knocked the fight clean out of him. I wasn't a fighter by nature, but adrenaline made me someone else that night, and when one of Pierce's loyalists rushed me with a pipe, I grabbed the nearest, wrench, and swung with every ounce of fury I'd bottled up since the day Elena's arm snapped, the clang echoing as he dropped like a stone. The brawl was fast and brutal, and by the time the dust settled, Pierce's crew was scattered, groaning in defeat, weapons clattering to the floor, as neighbors who'd followed us and cheered from the sidelines, recording everything to ensure no one could twist the story later. Vince stood over the ringleader, a wiry man with a busted lip, and growled, "Tell Pierce's ghost of an empire, it's done, finished ashes in the wind," before dragging him outside and leaving him sprawled on the curb like trash waiting for pickup. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but this time when the officers arrived, they saw everything for what it was. Neighbors shouting the truth, videos streaming live, proof piled against Pierce's cronies, and instead of hassling us, they slapped cuffs on the beaten men and thanked the bikers for stepping in where the system had been too slow. As dawn broke, the warehouse smoldering with the remnants of the fight, Vince clapped me on the back and said, "Family protects family. That's the only law that matters." And though I was exhausted, bloodied, and shaking, I believed him, because Elena's smile, when she hugged me later, was proof enough that we'd done right. In the weeks that followed, Pierce was formally charged with assault, embezzlement, and weapons violations, his cronies either in jail or scattered into obscurity. The HOA dissolved by court order as neighbors voted to rebuild their community without chains of fear. And though the bikers eventually rode back to their highways, they left behind more than tire marks. They left behind a neighborhood that had learned to stand up, to fight back, to never again let a petty tyrant wear a fake badge and call it law. Sometimes at night, I still hear the echo of those engines, the rumble that announced vengeance had arrived, and I'll never forget how it felt to watch men who thought they held power crumble beneath the weight of real loyalty, real justice, and the kind of revenge only family could deliver.